Thank you, Sheri, for joining us. Before we get going on this webinar, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things, kind of give you some background. Obviously, with COVID coming in as an issue in the beginning of the year, we wanted to find a way to deliver some information from researchers to producers and agronomists, and seeing as the growing point was based around a hands-on approach, this obviously became a challenge. So in the field webinars was a direction we thought could be supportive in this time of not being able to do in-field webinar or to do in-field viewings. It looks like we're opening up now, so maybe by the end of the year we might have some in-field trials that we can go to, but for the time being we're hoping to provide some support this way. So we're just looking to create a connection between those researchers and producers and agronomists. So today's webinar is about PGRs and will feature Sheri Strydhorst. I believe it'll be about a 40-minute presentation, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. You can ask questions during the session. There's a few different ways to do that. I encourage that if you are asking a question during the session, kind of keep it on topic. If it's off topic, we can push that to the end and address that to the end. So there's 3 different ways to ask a question. If you look at the bottom of your window, there's a bunch of buttons there. There's one button that's the Q&A button. If you click that, you can ask a question. It'll be directed straight to me. I can then address that question or let you vocalize that question. You can also raise your hand, which gives me the ability to give you the mic, and you can ask the question verbally. And then most people use the chat function. So if you go to the bottom and click that chat function, it should pop up on the side of your screen. And then I encourage you to go to where you type in. There's a little drop-down menu there that'll say all panelists. Click that all panelists button and select all panelists and attendees. This allows everyone to see the same question that you're asking, and might get some more people thinking about different questions. So make sure you change that now before we move forward. So again, all of those options are at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, I highly encourage you guys to share this on Twitter with #TheGrowingPoint. We love seeing your tweets. We love getting feedback. Sound should be so by tagging the Alberta Wheat and Alberta Barley Commissions and using the agronomy line, #TheGrowingPoint. So that's all I have to say. Now I'll let Sheri get to it, who you guys came here to listen to, and I'll go on silent. So take it away, Sheri.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So we're going to talk about plant growth regulators and what you need to know. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about my background. So I'm a research scientist focused on agronomy at Alberta Agriculture. We run a small plot research program. Here is my purple seed drill. Got the tractor there. My technicians and my crew make it possible to collect this very applied research, and without them I wouldn't be able to extend great information to you. I am an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta, so I have that opportunity to supervise graduate students, which I love training that next generation of scientists. But definitely my favorite thing to do is to be out in the field talking to farmers. This is a field day from last summer. I hope we can get back to that point this year. So let's cross our fingers that this relaunch strategy keeps going well. But I do think it's so important that my research is published and peer-reviewed and presented at international conferences. So to make sure that I do give you guys reputable information. For some of you who know me on the personal side, we do have a farm up around Nerlandia. I help make management decisions and go get fuel more than anything. But I do live the reality that farmers are facing. I see some of the struggles that we have in rural areas where we've got runoff that is going past over our roads and making things impassable. We've also got the good times of harvest and maybe some years the not so good times of harvest. This here is a picture of me and my family in in Peru, and we are standing in a faba bean field. So it's great to see the same crops in different parts of the world, but the different production practices as well. Here, the field is about the size of my house, and such different practices, but same growing food to feed the world. And then me and my family, we sometimes have to tour field plots for summer holidays. So I do live the reality that you guys are farming. So back to the topic of what we're going to cover today, we're going to focus a little bit about lodging, kind of outline what lodging is, what PGR options do growers have, what are some of the PGR risks, and then we're going to zone in on PGR performance on different wheat cultivars, and then talk a little bit about PGR use in barley. And if you guys have questions, if you don't understand what I am saying, or content-wise, let's address them throughout the presentation, and Jeremy can field those questions. And then if we have discussion questions or bigger questions about PGRs, let's save those till the end, and we'll have that discussion there. So to start out, lodging, this is of course severe lodging. This was snow-induced lodging, but certainly lodging is a big problem on farms. And we've got some live polls here as part of this presentation, and I'm gonna cross my fingers that the technology works out. So if you guys could just answer these questions and just do a quick answer, I'll read through the question and the answers. How often is lodging in your cereal crops a management issue for you? Never, 1 to 25% of the time, so once every 4 years. 26 to 50% of the time, so every second year. 50 to 75% of the time, 1 or 3 years out of every 4 years, or every year. So I'd love to see your answers to that. Just kind of get some engagement from you guys.
Just rolling in the votes here, Sheri. Can you see it? Can you see it? I think
I am not seeing the responses. I am just seeing the question at this point.
We'll end that.
So I'm not sure everyone can see, but 48% of the time, people are experiencing it every second year. So, you know, this is certainly a real issue on farm if we're facing this about 50% of the time. And certainly some are less and some are more, but no one is never. So just to continue at this look at lodging, and what are kind of some of the economics around it? So lodging can reduce yields. There was a nice paper that looked at lodging and found that lodging can reduce yields from 7 to 35% of the time. And the biggest yield reduction happens when lodging occurs within 20 days after anthesis. And to put that in perspective, if we say anthesis happens kind of that mid-July when we're spraying our FHB fungicide timing, go 20 days after that, it's kind of that that mid-July to the first week of August is that critical period for lodging. If we get severe lodging there, that's when we get big yield losses. So if we go through a little bit of math, what is this actually costing you? So if a grower has minimal lodging, 7% yield loss on a moderate 65 bushel crop, they'd be losing 4.6 bushels per acre, about $29 an acre. So on a small farm that has 600 acres of wheat, that's about $17,000. If we have severe lodging, when we have those wind and rain events that coincide and cause extreme lodging, there is potential for lodging loss yield of 23 bushels per acre, $147 per acre, or $88,000 for the farm. So lodging is costing farmers money. In addition to yield losses, though, we can, of course, when we have grain laying on the ground, we can get sprouting of that grain and decrease grade, which is a whole nother set of quality problems. Now, the lodging losses, the magnitude of that loss really depends on a number of factors. The first is cultivar. We all know that some varieties stand better than others, and that's part of the decision you make as a grower or an agronomist when you're selecting the variety to grow. The growth stage, we talked about that critical period, 20 days after anthesis, and the severity of lodging. Is your crop, lodged about 5-10 degrees? That's not so bad, but if it is lodging to that 80 degrees and just off the ground, off the surface of the ground, that's certainly where we're going to get bigger losses. The amount of wind and rain, we've got a nice diagram that's going to follow here, and we'll show you when wind causes wet lodging and rain causes wet lodging. And then there's the early snowfall. This image of this field of oats is sadly when we had one of those early September snowfalls, and basically all the crop was out, and PGRs aren't going to help us out there, but it is a reality of the lodging losses. So why do we get lodging? It's a combination of weak stems and weakly anchored roots. There's actually two types of lodging. There's stem lodging and root lodging, and we'll also look at what those differences are in the upcoming diagram. Insect or disease infections, I think the fantastic example here is with field pea. When we have that beautifully standing crop of peas towards the end of July, but then we get that August long weekend and that Ascochyta microspirella has destroyed the base of those stems, and we get that beautiful crop falling over and going from being 4 feet high to 4 inches high, and that's certainly a struggle for growers. We know that increased fertilization, when we push our nitrogen fertility rates, that leads to increased lodging. But of course, growers are trying to balance the higher inputs with the higher yields and the profitability. Higher seeding rates do tend to increase lodging, and poor genetics, that some varieties just stand better than others. Some species stand better than others. But on the breeding side of things, to be fair, I do really want to highlight that lodging resistance has greatly improved over the last 40 years due to the incorporation of dwarfing genes. Shorter plants do not lodge nearly as much as they did in the past. So I want to acknowledge Amy Magan. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba, and her and I did a joint presentation on PGRs at the Plant Health Summit back in February, and she had some nice slides that explain stem lodging and root lodging. So stem lodging is where we have the stem buckles and it bends and the plant falls over. So this occurs when we have the wind exerting leverage on the plant. Now we have root lodging, and this is when rain decreases the soil strength and the anchorage, and we actually have a slight pulling of the roots out of the soil, and that can induce root lodging. So here we've got the image of stem lodging, where we've got that bend and the break in the stem, and then the root lodging here, where we've got the root plate spread and the root depth weakens with rainfall, and you can see how the roots have shifted there in the soil. So these are, I think, great for really understanding what's happening in the different types of lodging, because I think we commonly think of only the stem lodging, but root lodging is a huge part of the lodging that we experience. So when do we get root lodging versus stem lodging? Well, when we don't have lots of wind or rain, we have no lodging, and that's kind of the ideal. However, root lodging happens when we have higher rainfall amounts and low wind. We get stem lodging when we have higher wind and not so much rain, but we get the combination of the root and the stem lodging when we have those big storms with the driving winds and the hard rains combined, and that's kind of a worst case scenario. So any of the plant growth regulators that are going to reduce your plant height are certainly going to help with that leveraging effect, because it is closer to the ground, and we don't have a heavy thing way up here being the seed head blowing around, but rather it is closer to the ground, and that reduces that leverage. So that's the problem. What options do growers have for controlling this lodging? And we're going to go into a little bit of plant hormones, not too much. One of the group of plant hormones is gibberellins. And I love this photo. They were first discovered in 1934 with rice plants in Japan that were infected with a fungus that releases a gibberellin. So these here are the healthy rice plants, and these here rice plants were infected with the fungus, and they're being exposed to higher levels of the plant hormone gibberellin. And you can see these are taller, thinner, lankier plants. And what we want to do with some of our plant growth regulators is prevent gibberellins or active gibberellins from being formed in the plant. So gibberellin inhibiting PGRs prevent this type of activity in the plant. So the first gibberellin inhibiting PGR is chloride. That's the active ingredient. And this active is registered for use in all of Europe, Australia, and most wheat producing countries. Now, just a little bit of history in Canada, PMRA approved the use of chloride in wheat in 2015. However, we had a little trade issue because the United States did not have an MRL or a maximum residue level for chloride. The paperwork eventually all went through the Environmental Protection Agency, and in 2018, manipulator became a real option for growers in Canada to use because we didn't have that trade barrier with the US. Now, manipulator with the active ingredient chloride is an option for Canadian wheat growers, and we can sell into the US. There have been new crops added to the label for manipulator, but we'll actually chat about that a little bit later when we have a discussion on barley. The other gibberellin inhibiting PGR is trinexapac ethyl, and it's registered for use in many countries, and there's MRLs, so that whole trade dispute issue isn't going to be an issue with this product because it's registered in the European Union, the US, and Japan. Now, this product was submitted for PMRA approval in 2017. We are expecting a decision in 2020, and we are hopeful this will be available in the 2021 growing season. So this product has a trade name Modus, and it is from Syngenta. So a few options there. The other product that you're probably aware of, it's been on the market for a long time, is Ethyl. Now, those first two were gibberellin inhibiting PGRs. Ethyl has a different mode of action. It does not affect gibberellins in the plant. It actually increases ethylene production in the plant, so another class of plant hormones. But it's quite picky, and there are different opinions on that, but it's picky enough for staging that Bayer makes growers, when they purchase this product, sign a waiver stating that yield or quality decreases may occur if it's not used properly, and it's kind of your problem. So careful staging and being aware of how to use this product is really important. And I think the message that resonates with me really loudly is growers under irrigation who have long-term experience with this, when they tell me that they spray the hilltops of their wheat fields one day and come back 24 hours later when those lower areas are at the right growth stage and spray then, I think that really does speak loudly to how careful staging should be with this particular product. So we've got another live poll here, and the question is, which PGRs do you have firsthand experience with? You've never used a PGR, none. Chloride, manipulator, trinexapac ethyl being Modus, or Ethyl for the third product there. We'll let votes come in there and see how many of you have been using PGRs.
Just watching the votes come in here, Sheri.
Fantastic. Gives me a little chance to catch my breath here, so these live polls. Okay, so 64% have had no experience with PGRs, which is understandable since they're relatively a new product on the market. 12% of viewers have had experience with manipulator, 9% with Modus, and just to clarify for people, although this is not registered with PMRA, there have been, Syngenta's been doing registration 10-acre kind of firsthand experience, and 15% have experience with Ethyl. So we do have a little bit of PGR experience out there, but I know a lot of people are curious about them. Okay, so I want to cover aspects of staging, and staging is critical with PGRs, and this is the label from Ethyl. So I do want to be clear that staging is far more critical for Ethyl than something like manipulator or Modus. For Ethyl, the label states that correct timing is critical for success, but also to ensure crop safety. And with our Modus and manipulator, like products, we have a sweet spot. So it's for that really good shortening, there is that sweet spot. So a gibberellin inhibiting PGR, like Manipulator, here I've got a little quote from the label, that Manipulator 620 is a PGR for use on spring and winter wheat between growth stage 12, so that's the 2-leaf stage, and growth stage 39, which is the flag leaf stage. So that's the big range of safety, which is great that there's such flexibility, because we know you can't always get into the field at the sweet spot. But to hit that sweet spot, to get the best shortening and the best height reduction of your crop, it's growth stage 30 to 32. And because this is a bit of a new concept, many people want to know how many leaves is that. It can vary. Tillers make it confusing. So really the best approach is to pull out plants, remove the tillers, and look at that main stem, and you've got your base node and your first node. And if you cut that open, you can see the distance on this individual plant is 1 centimeter, and that's growth stage 31. So that's that sweet spot where the first node, being your tiny little head here, is 1 centimeter above the base node. Now, those orange boxes just kind of pop that up. But what about kind of the end of the sweet spot window? And here what we've got in the first image, or all the images, this is the distance between the basal node and the first node. And here it is more than 2 centimeters. Here it's about 1 centimeter, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters. So that's that to get us to growth stage 31. Now with growth stage 32, you want to look at the distance between the first node and your head, and you can see that's that tiny little head there just forming. And here that distance is more than 2 centimeters. So node 2 is at least 2 centimeters above node 1. And I know my mind turns to jelly here when we start talking about this, but you can see it's this distance between, you've got that first node there and your second node, and you want that distance to be 2 centimeters. So the first one is at growth stage 32, growth stage 32, growth stage 32, and we actually are starting to get the elongation of the next node. This last one though is growth stage 31, because this distance here is not yet 2 centimeters. So something to be mindful of. And I think one of the things to be mindful of why this window is important is that we want to stop the elongation of these internodes. And a PGR is not going to reverse growth. So if you get your PGR and stop these internodes from becoming longer, that is really what our goal is here, because PGRs will not make these internodes shorter. They will only prevent future internodes from elongating. So that's the situation for Manipulator and Modus. Staging for ethereal though, or ephathon, is different. It's growth stage 37 to 45, and you can see these plants look a lot bigger. The first here is an example of growth stage 37, and that's defined as when that flag leaf is just visible and it's still rolled. And you can see how that 8th flag leaf is really nice and tightly rolled. Growth stage 39 is, I think, one we're all quite familiar with. The flag leaf is fully unrolled and that ligule is just visible. Then we've got growth stage 45 here, and what we're zoning in on is the late boot, and the flag leaf sheath is swollen. So what we're looking at growth stage 45 is this swollen area here. And then growth stage 49 is right here where we got these first awns poking out. And we'll put the box around that there. And we don't want to apply ethereal when more than 10% of the awns have emerged. So when you are scouting your field, you go and find 10 representative plants, you count those 10. If more than one of those plants has awns emerging, that window is closed. So just for growers to be mindful of that. If, for example, you have, maybe 1 in 20 with awns poking out, it is windy, you don't have the ethereal yet, it's probably best to path on that PGR application, because you would be spraying outside the application window. So we're going to move on next to PGR risks, because they are not maybe as simple and straightforward as what we might all think. And I've got an 8-year-old, so we do play a little bit of PGR truth or dare. So that's where kind of the theme from this comes from. So these comments are from published papers from other jurisdictions. And the first comment is that PGRs do not eliminate lodging in highly susceptible crops. So if you've got a crop where you've got high rainfall, high fertility, high seeding rate, and maybe, for example, it's barley, a PGR will not eliminate lodging in those situations. When you have all of those factors in place that are just about guaranteed to cause you lodging. What PGRs may do, though, is delay the onset of lodging. So maybe instead of your crop lodging at the end of July, it might not lodge until early August, or it might lessen lodging. So you might have your plant, instead of lodging, you know, to about a 45 degree, it might lodge to 30 degrees. And these are certainly things to consider, but don't think that every PGR application is going to make your crop stand poker straight. Now, we can have, and this is in the absence of lodging, variable effects on yield, because sometimes PGRs increase yield, sometimes they decrease yield, and sometimes they can have no impact. And we don't quite understand why we get some of these things happening, and when sometimes we don't, but it is important to be mindful that that you can't always count on a yield increase from a PGR application, particularly in the absence of lodging. Some of the things, we are altering the plant's hormonal system, and along with that, we can get changes in the development and the physiological behavior of the plant. So what some of these look like, the first is that we tend to see the green color of the foliage is intensified. When we measure the greenness of the crop with NDVI, we always see that it is greener, and we think, wow, that's great. We get more photosynthesis, which leads to more sugar productions and more yield. However, the complication comes when we get that green color intensified, and it leads to extended longevity of plants. And we regularly see that senescence is delayed or maturity is delayed. And for growing environments where they have lots of time, that is wonderful. It does contribute to many benefits. But where we have a short growing season and we are running into frost at seeding, at frost at seeding and at harvest, but that it does increase the chance of complications with harvest difficulties. Continuing on this list, the optimum temperatures for PGR uptake is above 5 degrees Celsius. And now is kind of the window when we'd be spraying these gibberellin inhibiting PGRs. And certainly we have mornings when that temperature can be around that 5 degrees Celsius, maybe 4 degrees Celsius, when growers want to spray before the wind comes up. And we are applying these in our environment in conditions that are not optimal for PGR use simply because of our climate. Sometimes we see temporary short-term height reduction. With our plots, we take our plants and we measure them 2 weeks to 3 weeks after the PGR application. We very much always see those nice big height reductions, but by the end of the growing season when we measure height, sometimes that height reduction isn't still there at the end of the growing season. So we want to temper grower expectations with what they might see there. We can get an increase in tillering and potentially late unproductive tillers. And this is one of those things with ethereal. If you are spraying at the beginning of July and you get the initiation of a tiller that's starting in July, the chance of that maturing by harvest is going to be tough, and you don't want to be waiting for late unproductive tillers to mature to get that through your combine. And then reduced grain weight. That's very typical, that reduced 1,000 kernel weight, and we certainly have seen that here. So I'm not trying to scare you off of PGRs, but I do want you to be aware of some of the complications that are real with these products. Now, PGRs under stress, and you can see this is a map from 2015 when we had some very dry conditions. And the labels of ethereal and manipulator both state that you don't want to use these products under excessive drought, excessive moisture, or excessive heat. And the same with manipulator. Don't use it if your crop is under stress from waterlogging, drought, or nutrient deficiency. If you do have hot, dry weather, apply in the early morning and evening. And I think if we are under extreme drought conditions, growers need to really think about Mother Nature being their PGR. PGRs are for use under those optimal growing conditions when you're pressing fertility and pushing plant populations and pushing yield, and you have the moisture associated with it. We do certainly have conditions when there's too much moisture where a PGR may not be warranted either, but really give thought under drought conditions to using a PGR. I've got here the next slide. This is where we actually saw some yield reductions in our in our small plots. And what we did was we measured the soil moisture content and the air temperature when we applied the PGRs. And where we saw yield reductions, we had between 8% soil moisture to 10% soil moisture. And you can see very dry soil conditions. So we had that drought stress was resulting in yield reductions. And the other locations where yields were fine, we had higher soil moisture, but also high temperature at the time of application and low relative humidity. So other factors that you really want to avoid, because you don't want to do something to try and help your crop and end up harming it. So be really mindful of the heat stress, drought stress around PGR use. Now I'm going to take some slides from Amy Magan, again, that PhD student at the University of Manitoba, and she wanted me to acknowledge the Manitoba Wheat and Barley Grower Association because they did fund this research. But she has some excellent slides that answer some questions that I frequently get, and she's got some good data on some of the things that growers are asking about PGRs. So her project is looking at agronomic strategies to minimize lodging risk while maximizing yield and protein in spring wheat. And she looks at different cultivars, different nitrogen management, seeding rates, and PGRs. And we're going to focus on this whole PGR application piece. So she had, and these of course are trials in Manitoba at Carmen and Manitou over 2 growing seasons. And she applied manipulator as her PGR at 0.7 liters per hectare at that sweet spot, that growth stage 31 to 32. And you can see here she's, this plant is nicely at growth stage 31. So the growing conditions in her study were drier than normal. They had lower yield potential than normal and low lodging pressure. So these are kind of things to keep in the back of your mind when we're interpreting these results. Now, what she saw in terms of nitrogen dynamics, and I think this question comes up fairly often, so we've got the live poll on this. Are you concerned with wheat protein decreases associated with PGR use? Simple no, yes, or unsure. So if you guys can log in your responses here, that would be fantastic.
Votes are coming in. I'll just take this moment quickly, Sheri, to let everyone know who's been trying to type in the chat. Again, to go to the bottom of the chat where you type in there, and there's a little drop-down menu that'll say all panelists. Click it and change it to all panelists and all attendees. That way everyone can see your comments or questions. If you want to do something targeted at just Sheri and I, you can go into the Q&A and that'll go directly to us. So just wanted to take that second to say that.
Okay, so in terms of concern with protein, 42% of the panelists are concerned about that. So let's look into that a little bit more here. So this is Amy's data, and the blue bars are the protein content when there was no PGR, and the yellow bars are the protein content with manipulator application. So the first comment is that because these were conducted under drier conditions, grain protein levels were high across all locations. So that was more a reflection of the environment. However, at each site year, protein was reduced regardless of the yield increases. So it was very consistent. There was a significant reduction in grain protein content at all of her sites. Now, of course, you guys are asking why that would be. So what Amy did was she took a look at the nitrogen uptake before anthesis in the plant, so harvested plants, and looked up nitrogen content before anthesis in the untreated and the treated, and she found that with manipulator, the plant had actually taken up less nitrogen, which makes a bit of sense because we do have these shorter plants. However, by the end of the growing season, the untreated and the manipulator treated wheat had the same amount of nitrogen uptake, and the thinking behind that, so we had decreased nitrogen uptake from planting to anthesis, but no difference in total nitrogen uptake by the end of the growing season with manipulator. And what is thought is that we talked about in the PGR Truth or Dare that manipulator will delay maturity, and that longer window after anthesis is allowing that plant to take up nitrogen later, but is not actually early enough to impact the protein content. That's what some of the thinking is here as to why we're seeing some of these protein decreases in some of our wheat. So, I think quite helpful information from Amy there. Now, what about the lodging risk? We are applying these PGRs really to manage lodging. So unfortunately, because Amy did have drier conditions in her studies, there was only one site that had lodging in her study. And you can see here that this is the lodging at that one site with no nitrogen. Of course, there was no lodging, with 70 pounds of actual N, 140, an ESN blend and split N. And you can see that the more nitrogen, the more intensified the management, the more lodging. And that under those conditions of high lodging pressure, the manipulator worked really nicely to reduce lodging. You can see the yellow bar, there's a big reduction in that. So that's excellent. It's doing what we want it to do. However, we also saw that the PGR reduced lodging when we had different plant populations. So low plant population was 150 plants per meter squared, 250, and 350. So you can see, first of all, the effect of increasing plant populations on increasing lodging, but also how the manipulator works well under those conditions to reduce lodging. So the manipulator did, as it was supposed to, reduce lodging in treatments with high lodging potential. Now, what was it doing in terms of the plant structure? So Amy measured the internode length, so the distances between these internodes, and found that manipulator, that internode length was reduced. So that's how the plant is achieving that reduction in lodging. She did measure stem width, so with calipers measuring how wide that is, and there was no difference between the manipulator treated and the untreated. And this is a difficult thing to measure, and in the published studies there isn't that consistency. So really manipulator is reducing lodging risk by reducing these internode lengths. The next thing, though, to look at is the roots. And we talked about stem lodging and root lodging. Now, what Amy did, and I really commend them for all the work they did, was they measured the rooting depth and the rooting spread. So you can see that in the image here. And she saw that at one location, with the manipulator, the rooting spread was wider. So you can see at one location, this distance was wider, but at 3 of the 4 locations, they got an increase in rooting depth. And that's what allowed them to reduce some of that lodging risk by making those roots deeper there. So a lot of work, but does answer some good questions in terms of what is happening in terms of the change of the plant physiology to reduce lodging. So just some of Amy's take-home messages, and I didn't touch on yield, but in her study, she found that yields increased by 3 to 5 bushels per acre, and that yield increase was achieved because there were more kernels per head or per acre, but they did have smaller kernels, and that is consistently seen, and we see that in Alberta studies as well. In terms of nitrogen dynamics, the grain protein content decreased between 0.1 to 0.4%, so that consistent decrease in protein, and that was attributed to decreased nitrogen content in that period prior to anthesis. She did see reduced lodging in those high-risk situations where there was the high nitrogen and the high seeding rate, and I think that really speaks to where you should use a PGR when you do push nitrogen, when you do push seeding rates. But what helped to decrease lodging was reducing those internodes, decreasing the canopy height, and the increased root anchorage strength, so those wider roots and the deeper roots at one site. So that's how it was achieving the reduction in lodging. But they didn't get that stem being wider. So again, to acknowledge Amy and thank her for the great work that she is doing. That work is being written up and published now as we speak. So I'm going to shift over to some more of my Alberta work, and we're going to look at PGR performance in different wheat cultivars. And this quote is actually from a nice review paper out of Europe. And I really like the statement that the risk of lodging is strongly affected by the variety and the management factors. So your sowing date, your seeding rate, your drilling depth, and your rate of nitrogen application. So when I started working with Alberta agriculture in this area of plant growth regulators, I did a little bit of research to just look at what international studies had found. And one of the ones that kind of piqued my interest was this study out of Indiana, and they were using etheryl and manipulator, or the active ingredients from those two products. And what they found here was that they saw increased yield in 1 of 4 cultivars, and that really struck me that not all cultivars were responding the same to the PGR application. So this, I apologize, this is from the Saskatchewan guide, borrowing from our neighbors here. But when you look at a variety, of course, it has different traits, and we all know that. So the rating for lodging for Brandon is good. The lodging rating for Eli is good, and the lodging rating for Stettler is fair. So if we were to make our PGR decisions simply based on this, we would probably put a PGR on Stettler and maybe on Parata there with a fair rating, and maybe leave it off of something like a Carberry, and maybe on the Brandon and the Eli. But I want to share with you some images of what we saw at Barhead in 2017. We pushed fertility. We had great rainfall that caused lodging, and this top set of images here is Brandon wheat. The seed guide says it's 81 centimeters tall. It has a good lodging rating. And with no PGR and us pushing fertility, we got lodging. So certainly this is something we wanted to manage with a PGR. So the conditions were right for using a PGR. With manipulator, you can see it is standing beautifully compared to no PGR. So this did exactly what we wanted it to do. And with Modus, so a gibberellin biosynthesis inhibitor, it certainly improved it compared to no PGR, but not quite as nicely as with manipulator. So that was the example with Brandon. Now with the variety Eli, actually a sister line from Brandon, and you can see, again, it's certainly lodging under those high input, high rainfall conditions. Now the manipulator does improve it, but the Modus looks just that little bit better. And so we're seeing a little bit of not each cultivar is responding equally well to each different product. And with the Stettler, remember that had the fair lodging rating, and no PGR is standing beautifully. With manipulator, it's standing beautifully. With Modus, it's standing beautifully. So I think there is a little aspect of unpredictability here, and we got to kind of play a little bit of a numbers game in terms of what is the chance that we're going to get a good PGR response from these different cultivar PGR combinations. So what I've done here is, this is the response of different CWRS wheat cultivars, and we tested them at St. Albert, at Barhead, and in Vermilion over 1 or 2 growing seasons. And we wanted to look at, this is the height reduction. How often did we have lodging? Because if you have a variety that only lodges 1/3 of the time, it might not need that PGR. But if you've got a variety like Brandon and Eli lodging 83 or 100% of the time, and 80% of the time it improves standability, or 100% of the time it improves standability, that's a good cultivar PGR combination. Here, if we've got Redwater, it lodges 67% of the time, but we never get a significant improvement in standability. So you really want to think about these PGR lodging, if it lodges in the first place, and if the PGR improves standability. So the ones highlighted in green are the ones where we get that consistent improvement in standability. And this is kind of a small data set, but it does give you that clue to maybe look at just how a particular cultivar responds to a PGR application. Those are the CWRS varieties. Here are CPS varieties. So Crossfield 4A and Rowan respond quite nicely. I want to highlight the variety Penhold. In the years of study, we never saw this variety lodge, so the PGR never helped it out with standability. That's the one variety that really, when I look through a regional variety trial, Penhold does stand very, very nicely. And I know there are growers out there saying, well, I can make Penhold lodge. Yes, but the frequency of it lodging compared to other cultivars is certainly less. I've got Crossfield highlighted here in orange because 50% of the time it had improved standability with manipulator, and 1/3 of the time we got improved yield, but we also got a decrease in bushel weight there. So just one of those ones that's maybe a little iffy, something to look at some data and consider if you are growing Crossfield and are considering a PGR on it. So to sum up this part, the different wheat cultivar by PGR responses, Brandon, Eli, and Thorsby. These would be the cultivars that are most likely to see a benefit from manipulator applied at growth stage 31 to 32. And this is based upon the frequency of the cultivar to lodge, but also the subsequent improvement in standability with manipulator. And then in the CPS class, 4A and Rowan are the two cultivars that would most likely see that benefit from manipulator because they tend to lodge and manipulator does help them stand. And then we've got Crossfield, which is one of those ones that's a little bit 50-50, so you want to give some thought to that and maybe try some strip trials. I should make the disclaimer that not all cultivars have been tested and different cultivars could respond differently in different environments. So I see we're running maybe a little shorter on time here. We're going to now focus on just how PGRs perform in barley. And we've got a live poll here from Jeremy. And do you think PGRs work equally well on all cereal species? So no, yes, or unsure.
Answers are rolling in.
Perfect. And I'm maybe just going to continue here while those answers roll in. And we've got a slide here, and this is from 1977, but it looks at a number of different barley varieties, or wheat, barley, and oat varieties, and they see that the one thing that is quite consistent is wheat is a species that shows the largest height reduction with manipulator. So it's kind of the best match for PGR or for manipulator. Oh, I just see the poll results come in here, and you guys are all very smart, and maybe it's a tip-off that we're asking the question, do you think PGRs work equally well on all cereal species? 78% said no, so a good knowledge there. So we'll cruise through this quickly, that really manipulator works best on wheat. When we tried some of these on Alberta cultivars in the Alberta environment, we found that oat and wheat were the most responsive and barley was less responsive to manipulator. So really the message is that in different environments, Ontario versus Alberta, with different cultivars, those 1977 era versus the 2017 era, we get different responses to manipulator. But to zoning here on barley, so at present, manipulator is the only registered PGR for use on barley. But, and I want to stress this, research trials have found that Trinexapac alone is much more effective on barley than manipulator alone at reducing plant height and improving standability. And from that review paper, that was based on Alberta experience, but from a review paper that looks at global responses, they do show that barley is less responsive to chlormequat chloride and chloride than wheat, rye, triticale, or oats. So therefore, products containing Trinexapac or the ethylene-releasing compounds are the best choices for reducing lodging in barley. And I do want to point out that etheryl barley used to be on the label and it is no longer on the label. So I think waiting for the registration for Trinexapac on barley is going to be the sweet spot for Canadian growers. And just, this isn't a marketing thing. We've got here an image with no PGR. We have got manipulator on barley, and this is 22 days after the PGR application and Trinexapac. And you can see that we do have the biggest height reduction on the Trinexapac treated barley there. This here is some barley that we treated with a 1.5 time rate of manipulator and a 1.5 time rate of Trinexapac. And it is quite night and day. It's very clear to see that the Trinexapac product, the Modus, really works well on barley. We are doing some recent work with cultivar-specific responses of barley. Again, this is from that Ontario study. This isn't a new thing. They saw that 30 varieties of barley showed some height reduction, 5 varieties had no response, and 15 varieties of barley got taller. So again, that manipulator barley combination is not going to be your winning product combination, cultivar combination. We did a number of studies and site years of study on Amisk barley. in hindsight, probably not the best variety to use because it stood so incredibly well. But with Manipulator and Amos barley, we got a 1.3 height reduction, so tiny, a 2% protein reduction, and a 2.2% yield increase. So I think the messaging that we saw here is that not all barley cultivars need a PGR, and this is a 6-row barley. Certainly others could benefit from a PGR, but with this Amos, it wasn't a good fit because it didn't need it. Now we're recently started some work with varieties that do need a PGR, Austenson, Copeland, Synergy, and Bow. And we had typical fertility and really pushing fertility without a PGR, and then with Modus there. And one of those PGR truth or dares is that when you have that perfect storm for lodging, 140 kilograms of nitrogen, plus we had 52 pounds of nitrogen. When you have 177 pounds of nitrogen on barley and 10.3 inches of rain, you're going to get lodging with or without that PGR. So I think that's reiterating that point that a PGR will not prevent lodging when conditions are perfect for lodging, that high fertility, a cultivar that lodges, and the weather conditions. So do be mindful that a PGR will not necessarily prevent lodging. So on barley, Manipulator is the only PGR registered for use right now. That higher rate, the 1.25 to 1.5 times the wheat rate of Trinexapac, is ideal, but it's not registered yet. And if you have 177 pounds of actual N and 10 inches of rain, it's not going to solve all your barley standability issues. So do temper that. So I'll wrap up here in terms of take-home messages. PGRs will not eliminate lodging in highly susceptible crops. They may delay the onset of lodging or lessen lodging. Oh, maybe let's just wait for that poll here for or I guess people can run through that while I'm reading this. And then gibberellin biosynthesis inhibiting PGRs like Manipulator versus ethereal have very different application times and different risks. So I want people to be mindful of that. And for wheat, Manipulator is registered and it works fairly well on many, but not all cultivars. And we've seen really good response with Manipulator on Brandon, Eli, Thorsby, Foray, and Rowan. And then for barley, that slightly elevated rate of Trinexapac and Modus when that product is registered is going to be the best choice for growers. And with that, I want to thank the funders that we do have who supported this research. Couldn't have done it without them. And a couple of sources of extra reference materials. There is this AgriFax that's available at this website here. So that's a good resource. There's going to be a chapter in the Alberta Wheat Production Manual that is coming out soon. And then there's a YouTube video link here that takes a little bit of look at this if you want a recap. And for questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I think we'll take a quick peek at the live poll. Do you plan to use a PGR in the 2020 growing season? No, 35%, 38% said yes, and 27% are unsure. So there we go. And thank you guys very much. I appreciate you tuning in and listening to this webinar.
Thank you, Sheri. So we did have a few questions come in, and I mean, we had 70 people participate in this, so I want to thank everyone for signing in and being a part of this. We do have a couple questions that have come through, and I'll kind of go towards some of the earlier ones to make sure we've got all of them. So stem diameter is one measurement, and this came from, Mike Hillhurst. Stem diameter is one measurement, but I've seen actual stem wall thickness increased versus treated. Any comments on that?
I guess that is not work that I have done, but in the literature I've reviewed, it's one of those things that can occur but isn't always consistent. So, and Amy did look at that in her study, and she didn't find any stem wall thickening in that environment, but it does seem to be one of those inconsistent changes. So sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't, and we don't quite understand what perfect factors align to make it happen.
Okay. And then a question from Curtis Smith. Is anyone looking at hormones that focus on increasing root growth in combination with PGRs that inhibit node elongation?
I am not working with any of those groups right now, so I'm not up to speed on that. So maybe maybe some others might know better, but I'm not the right one for that question.
For sure. Lisa Nadeau, I hope I pronounced that properly. Are there any resources on the environmental risks or impacts of PGRs? And maybe those links that you provided at the end might be a good place to start.
Absolutely. And I imagine this slide deck will be available for people who wanted to review, and they can kind of look at some of those soil moisture and temperature and relative humidity numbers that we have there on that one slide.
Yeah, just on that point, as a reminder, everyone, this is recorded and we will be posting this after the fact, so you can go through and watch this at any point in the future as well. So another question from Curtis here: why was barley application removed from the ethereal label? And I believe that really has to do with Bayer's decision, and they don't even have to list why they're doing it. This was a question that came up previously to me, and I reached out to the government to ask what happened, and it's really up to Bayer to make that decision. So I don't know, Sheri, if you know any more information.
I don't have my speculation is that the risk is there, and when you get too much use where the time is off and you get those negative PGR things coming through too frequently, I suspect that's maybe attributed to why Bayer took that off the label, but we would have to, I don't know for sure.
Melinda Thalacker, I'm not going to pronounce that properly. How stable PGR after field application? I'm not sure I fully understand that question, Melinda. Are you asking how stable the molecule is before uptake? Maybe give me a little bit more information on that. Yes, that's what she's asking. How stable is that product, I guess, once you apply it?
And sadly, I, again, won't be able to answer that. I think one of the things, though, with these plant hormone products is they are relatively short-lived in the plant. So, you know, you do want to apply them under warmer conditions, not stressful conditions, so the plant can uptake them and integrate them into their system and make them start acting as soon as possible.
Okay. Chrysanthi asked, by looking at advantages and disadvantages, do you recommend PGRs? Especially, is this economical to use?
I think that's a tough one. I think it so depends on the inputs that a grower is using. If you have a growing season where everything is shaping up by the beginning of June, that you have that fertility, you have an ideal growing environment, so the rains have come at the right time, you've got a variety that will lodge. So if I was going Brandon, and I put down 150 pounds of nitrogen and the rains were ideal, I would certainly be thinking about using manipulator on that crop. However, if I was in Boychyn and I was growing penhold wheat and we had 2 inches of rain, that would not be a decision I would make to put a PGR on that. So I do think it is very situation specific, and it's not one simple answer will fix everything. Or what can apply to all situations there. So consideration does need to be given to each individual circumstance for when it's considered to be used.
Okay, we've got another question on timing here, it looks like. I know many will try to tank mix PGR with herbicide. Is there a potential stress that can occur with the tank mix? If there is a second pass to apply a PGR, is there a certain time after herbicide app a grower should wait to avoid any stress?
So I believe there are some compatibility ratings between herbicides and PGRs, and I believe there's lists out there. I off the top of my head don't know where those would be, but you want to make sure they're tank mix compatible. And really, if you're putting this PGR on at your herbicide timing, generally means you're putting your herbicide on too late and you're not quite hitting that optimal PGR window. The other thing that there's been certainly some interest in is tank mixing your PGR at that growth stage 30 with an early fungicide application. And we are just wrapping up a study there with 8 site years of data, and it's really showing that PGR timing at that growth stage 30 to 32 is too early for your fungicide to benefit. So sadly, this is a separate pass to make it work as well as you possibly can. And I think we've got to remember PGRs are for very intensive production systems, and it's not just your typical entry-level agronomy management. It is that higher level, and it will require that extra pass.
Brian, my co-host here, do you want to take the next question there?
No, but I was just going to add or ask Sheri and Jeremy. We're just about out of time, and there is a few more questions and comments. Where do you guys live on the internet where people can contact you with their questions?
Here, if I just flip back here, there's my email address and my Twitter handle there, so you can reach me at those.
And I don't have a slide to put up, unfortunately, right now, but if you go to the Alberta wheat or barley website and look at the staff, you can find my contact information there to reach out to me as well. So we had a question here from Joseph that came in. In an example you gave on a MISC, there's a 2% protein reduction, but a 2.2% yield increase. Could this yield increase be attributed to a concurrent increase in starch content?
I guess that's something I haven't looked into. I know there's a lot of people who feel it is simply that offset of the extra yield or a protein dilution because of extra yield, but we can have no yield increase and still a protein reduction occurring in some environments. So I do want people to be mindful that it's not a simple correlation there.
Okay.
Probably
the oldest stands so well, Joseph, that I don't think you need the PGR on it.
The oldest question in the queue right now from Roger Barron: how is manipulator on oats?
On oats, we've done a little bit of work with it, and it can be fantastic, but it's not consistent.
Wonderful. I think there's another couple questions here. Was there a significant reduction in stem nitrogen content between treated and untreated? I don't know if that was measured, Sheri, was it?
I think Amy did look at that because that pre-anthesis, most of the nitrogen is in the stem and the leaf material. So yes, there was less nitrogen prior to anthesis in the entire plant material, including the stems. And I think it makes sense because we do have less biomass there.
Okay. So I think I've covered all the questions. If I haven't answered your question and it's up in the chat a little bit further, please put it in there again. But I think that's all of them. And again, I want to thank everyone for coming and being engaged and asking questions to Sheri. And Sheri, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. So again, everyone keep in mind this has been recorded, so you can follow up after on the Alberta Wheat and Barley YouTube, or go to the website. You can find those videos there and watch them all over again. So thank you again. My name is Jeremy Boychyn, and this was In the Field webinar brought to you by the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions. So we do this every week on Wednesdays at 11. Next week is going to be Dr. Kelly Turkington. He's going to be talking about fusarium headlight timing. So if you guys want to catch that, head over there now. Head over to the registration page now and register for that. Again, Sheri, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll chat soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Take care.